Hey guys, Sam here with Traffic is King. Today I wanted to talk to you about podcast marketing, traffic tips, and places to submit your podcast. Now I know a lot of you guys are focused on delivering your video content, producing video content, but don't leave out podcasts. And I'm going to tell you why. Podcasts, I think, are the most absorbed medium, consumed medium on the internet because so many people have MP3 players now. So many people have iPhones, iPod touches, Zoom players, and they're downloading podcasts by the hundreds and the thousands. So it's a medium that should not be ignored. And I'm just going to take you through a couple of statistics. Here, TechCrunch says that the iPhone, and this was November of last year, late November last year, iPhone is the number one handset in the world, taking over 62.8% market share of the smartphone market. Um, so that just tells you there's a lot of iPhones. I felt like I was the only person with a BlackBerry within a 10, 20-mile radius of where I was at yesterday. And also another statistic, iPhone makes up 50% of smartphone web traffic. So people are are using their phones. At least with iPhones, they're using their iPhones. They're downloading content. They're downloading apps. I know a lot of that content is podcast content. So it's another reason why you should be using podcasts to deliver your message. So I remember the good old days when Walkmans were ubiquitous, and I mean they were everywhere. Now you can say the same thing for MP3 players. So MP3 players are everywhere. Everyone has an MP3 player. You can just look around you and see that people have MP3 players. And what are people putting into these MP3 players? Well, I mean, if you have an iPod, if you have a Touch or a Shuffle, you're going to iTunes and you're downloading content, you're downloading podcasts. So that's just something to keep in mind as you see people with MP3 players around you. And as I said before, it's the most downloaded medium on the internet, in my opinion, because there's just so many shows. You can download shows on, how-to programs, any shows that are related to whatever interest that you have. It could be travel, it could be, techie stuff. I mean, whatever you can think of, there's pretty much a podcast for it. And people like listening to podcasts when they're on the go in their daily commute. If you go to the gym, you see people listening to their podcast. If you're riding a bus to work or a train, people have their MP3 players on. And sometimes on their computer also. So I know I listen to a couple of shows that I'm subscribed to, and I listen to it on my computer. So this is a reason why you should have podcast marketing in your traffic arsenal. And I'm going to tell you some real quick tips for traffic generation. First thing, when you're creating your podcast, be clear to mention your website, your landing page, or your blog URL. So throughout your podcast, make sure that you people know the name of your website and the URL of your website, so that way they can go to it after the podcast is done, or if they're on the computer, they can log into your website while listening to your podcast. And I have to do this. I haven't done this yet, but you want to have a good signature intro and outro. So this is kind of like a branding thing where people hear that sound or that intro, they know that, oh, okay, this is this website here. Or it's kind of like, I remember when Intel had that intro on their commercials, doom doo doo doo. You kind of knew it was Intel. You didn't even have to look at the commercial to know that it was an Intel commercial. Kind of like a jingle. And this is just a good way to brand your podcast if you're going to deliver them through a lot of podcast directories. And make sure to tell your listeners what you want them to do. So in your podcast, if you're promoting a landing page, or you want them to go to a landing page, or you want them to go into an opt-in box, or you want them to subscribe to a newsletter, tell them, hey, go to my website, subscribe to this newsletter, or go to my website, download this podcast, or go to my website, click on the link, and you can, get a free ebook. So in the podcast, just tell them what you want them to do, and a good majority, a good percentage of the time, your users will do it. So, wanted to show you after you've completed your podcast and you've made your podcast, you need to submit them to podcast directories. And here's a site called Pod Pusher. And I found this site, I stumbled upon this site by accident, and I'm kind of glad I did because I've been using it a lot to submit my podcast. But basically, it's a submission site where you submit your podcast to podcast directories. And this is kind of manually done, but all you do is you enter the title of your podcast, the feed of your podcast URL, the description, and the tags that's relevant to your podcast, and then it will submit to all these podcast directories. And I counted here, there's a little over 75 podcast directories. Now the only thing it doesn't submit to iTunes, so you would have to do that manually. So when you're submitting your podcast, after you've completed submitting to all these sites, then you would go into iTunes and submit your podcast to iTunes separately. So the name of this site is PodPusher. That's podpusher.com. You can look on the screen right there to see the URL. And make sure that you use podcast in your traffic generating techniques, and don't leave it out. It's a must-have. If you have any questions, please leave your comments below, and that way I know that you're a live person visiting my blog and not just an IP address. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you soon.